welcome, good afternoon. I'll say it again, welcome, good afternoon. I'm Elliot Gerson of the Institute, and delighted to see all of you this afternoon. I think this is going to be a fascinating and important conversation about, frankly, subjects that I wish we gave a lot more time to. And we'll probably talk a little bit about why it's so important to talk much more about Africa. Our topic is the African century, and as our little description claims, Africa is truly a rising giant. By 2050, 1 in 4 people on the planet will be African, and by 2060, fully half of the labor force on Earth will be African. The Institute actually does an increasing amount of work in Africa that many of you may not be aware of. I also have some personal involvement, longstanding involving Africa, unrelated to the Institute, but I think you'll be seeing more and more of us because of that work. We've had leadership initiatives in Southern Africa, East Africa, and West Africa for about 15 years. We have a program working in the health departments in more than 10 African countries. We have a program focused on building an ecosystem for small and growing businesses with a particular focus on Africa. We have other fellowships in Africa, and it keeps growing. But I'm most excited about the fact that we are soon to have our first Aspen Institute in Africa. We have, thank you. We have 13 Aspen Institutes now as international partners, and we now have officially approved by the board of the Aspen Institute an initiative for Africa, which will soon become something that will be probably initially called Aspen Institute Nairobi. It's going to be based in Kenya, but with Pan-African reach and interest. So very, very excited about that. And as I just alluded, you know, I think we see far too little about the continent in our media. And when we do see things about the continent, it's often grossly disproportionately about coups and famine and corruption and poverty and migration, and does nothing to really capture what in many instances is the extraordinary variety, 54 different countries, the youth, the diversity, the excitement, the pride, the promise, and the ambitions of that continent. You have already seen the biographies of these very distinguished people. I will be very brief so we can have as much time as possible for conversation. Abigail Azakwesili is the founder and president of Human Capital Africa. She is also a former presidential candidate in Nigeria, former Minister of Education, and she's now bringing her trademark work to develop citizen-led, values-based governance throughout the continent. Phumlazi Majozi is a prominent South African political and economic analyst and writer, widely seen in print and on television, and author of the book Lessons from Past Heroes. And Chiedo Nwankor is the Vice Dean for Education and Academic Affairs and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins, SAIS, and her work and extensive writings focus on many things, but including and particularly gender, economics, and politics. And on gender, I mentioned when I talked to her earlier today that I thought, and I see my wife here, she knows that my favorite T-shirt, which I acquired on my last trip to Africa last September, is that the future is female and African. And I'm very sorry I'm not wearing it. So let me begin with you, Abi, if I may. You have said, fascinatingly, quote, "The world needs Africa as much as Africa needs the world." Can you just tell us what you mean by that?
Thank you so very much, Elliot, and what a pleasure to be with very interesting people at the Ideas Festival. The world needs Africa just as much as Africa needs the world. We know clearly that the development process for countries that lagged behind before they caught up in the convergence happened as a result of the integration to the global economy. And so the importance of trade and the importance of movement of capital from one region to another, all of these were so important as factors for development. Yeah. When you look at Africa, it missed the agrarian revolution, missed the industrial revolution, missed even the beginnings of the knowledge revolution. But what Africa hasn't missed is the technology world. So the ICT has driven Africa in directions of structural change of economy. So for example, in my country, we now have about 6 or 7 unicorns in technology. So these are billion-dollar organizations. Who are the founders?
The Silicon Valley of Africa.
Who are the founders? The young people. Average age of Africa is 18.9 years, compared to the US at 38.5 years, Europe at 44.5 years, China at 37.5 years, India at 28.2 years.
And Japan higher than any of them.
Precisely. So really, anyone who is not seeing what that signals for a world that must continue to grow and prosper is definitely not adding up in their economics. And so I always say to people that in God I trust, but every other person must come with their data. And the data that I know of what this could mean in terms of productive workforce for the world requires that we all begin to perceive Africa as a potential global economic growth pole. And therefore, it is important for all of us to think of it as not a humanitarian case, but a business case.
Thank you. Pumlazi, South Africa just held an extraordinarily significant election. And with the ANC, of course, the Mandela's party, losing its majority for the first time. And can you just tell us a little bit? We don't have a lot of time. We could all spend hours about this because it's really one of the most interesting elections in the world. You know, how that happened and what it means for South Africa going forward.
Thank you so much. It's great to see you all, and you all look beautiful and handsome. Thanks for passing by. Well, thank you, Elliot. A very, very important question you've asked. Before the election, a week or two before, I read an article in The Economist magazine, and one of the things that they were looking at the state of democracy around the world, right? They have this thing called Democracy Index. And amongst the points that they made was that though South Africa's democracy it has its own flaws, but it's still, relative to its neighbors, a better democracy, right? The institutions, the government being held to account. Mm-hmm. So that was how they saw South Africa at the time. And coming out of this election, and I'm going to say this, I'm going to be very patriotic at this point right now, and that is I am proud of my country, right? In the sense that, and it also aligns to what The Economist said, and I totally agreed with their opinion that South Africa's democracy has huge potential, given the fact that, remember, the African National Congress that lost the election, it's a liberation movement that liberated black people from the apartheid system. So 30 years in, it's now losing power, because people they are saying, you know what, there are many things that are going wrong in the country, therefore you need to be held to account, right? We are going to hold you to account at the ballot box. And the whole thing has gone smoothly, right? The ANC, as the ruling party, the liberation movement, came out and considered the election, clean and said, look, we lost, we do agree, we do admit that we lost, It's time for us now to move on and begin the process or be part of the process where we have to form a coalition government, right? So, by the way, I mean, the NC losing, the NC, which is the Liberation Party, losing power, it's one of the trends that have been taking place in Africa over the past 35, 40 years, right? Where you've seen liberation movements, losing support in the African continent, in countries like Angola, Zambia, Namibia as well, in Zimbabwe. You've seen, all these liberation movements that fought against the colonial system. We are seeing them losing power now. Why? Mainly because they failed their own people, right? When you look at the incompetence and the corruption levels that have happened under our ruling party, or the party, the ANC, over the past 15 years or so, how it mismanaged the economy with significant blackouts, right? With the highest unemployment rates in the world, right? They're very much the high rates of crime. So, I mean, people are saying, the country is a mess, and you have to be held to account.
And tell this audience a little bit too, because some may not know about the Democratic Alliance and what makes it quite different.
Yes. So the Democratic Alliance is the biggest opposition party, right, in South Africa. It's largely a party that advocates for pro-business policies, pro-market policies, liberal policies, right? It's been challenging the ANC a lot over the past 15 years, I would say, because it's been growing over those years. And what's happening now, as we get into this phase where the ANC has to form a coalition government after it lost its majority last month, it's finding itself now having to govern in a coalition with the Democratic Alliance that Elliot is talking about, which has been a biggest opposition party for a long time in South Africa. Now, the Democratic Alliance is the biggest opposition party, but there are other parties as well that are smaller parties that, as we get into this, at least for now, they are trying to arrange for what's called a government of national unity, or for those smaller parties, they can also be part of them, along with the DA and the ANC. They can be part of that, of that government. So it's a fascinating time in South Africa, no doubt. It's a new era for us, a new phase. Many people are worried. There is those worries as to how are things going to play out now. You've had you've had for 30 years this very much dominant party, and no one was really challenging it. And now here they are, they have to govern in a coalition. Is this coalition going to last? Is it going to be something that is going to crumble? Right now, they are busy. It's been 2 weeks now. They are already battling as to who should hold what cabinet post, right? These parties that are forming the government. So there have been negotiations going on 2 weeks in after the inauguration of the president, and they are not finding each other as to the appointment of the cabinet. So fascinating times. Yeah.
It certainly are. Chito, when I referred to this a little bit obliquely, but can you give us some context about why, given the size and importance of Africa, about why the pivotal role of Africa in solving global problems are often ignored, and what needs to be done to change that, to bring Africa into the conversation and leadership in solving the world's problems?
Thank you, Elliot, and hi, y'all. Right, so, the parsimonious answer will be the lack or the absence of power and voice. But then scholars in the room would say, but what generates the absence of power and voice? And just like David Brooks, had talked about the other time, that politics, even in America, right, continues to be shaped by over 250 years of legacies. And that explanation also applies to Africa, right? Is that the legacies of how the world, right, has historically seen Africa. This idea of an infantile continent, an idea of a savage, lost continent. All of that has shaped the world, or the world as it was then, its relationship with Africa, which then became primarily extractive, with significant implications, right, for the position that Africa then came to occupy, which shapes, the idea of this veil and this lens through which Africa is seen, right? The lens and the veil of stereotypes, of prejudice, of generalization. So Africa is savage, Africa is ignorant, and all that nonsense, right? And so that has shaped Africa's marginalization, right? Because, of course, extractive relationships has meant that Africa produces primary commodities without value chains, right? And so it means that Africa remains in negative terms of trade, right? Again, power and voice. And so this essentially is why you have these relationships that continues to kind of exclude Africa. But then today, right, which I think is why we're here and talking about the African continent, and like Madam Obi has just said, is that it's going to be increasingly difficult to remain in that mood, to continue to see Africa as insignificant, right? People think Africa is coming for you. Africa is coming for you. Right? Because, in another, 20, 30 years, right, Africa will become the supplier of working-age folks, intelligent, skilled working-age folks. Africa is coming for you, right? So what it means is that we had better start engaging with Africa. And that means Africa becomes significant. That's the African century.
So let's continue on that for a second. You've often made the strong and quite provocative case that Africa is a business case and not a humanitarian case.
Yes.
And can you tell us, just building on what Chito just said, about why the world's advanced economies must update their strategy on Africa relating to that business imperative opportunity?
So when I look at what has happened in our world, where unwittingly, or perhaps even wittingly, we ended up having a monopoly production center for our world. So China became the factory of the world. And then COVID hits. And we all suddenly realized that everyone's waiting for China to provide something, or would all be at risk. And then I look at America and I look at Europe, and I just say to myself, how did the economics go so far right that we've ended up actually creating monopolies? What's that? Like, excuse me, how can systems that understand the power of decentralized options create what we found ourselves in? And when I look at that, I see the issue of the structural imbalances in competitiveness that we now have to deal with. And if we have to deal with it, whether it's in America, it's in Europe, especially in the case of Europe, because I get my European friends frequently saying to me, China. And I'm like, why are you worried about China? Aren't you embarrassed? This is your proximate neighbor, Africa. And you're worried about a continent or a country that has to go many nautical miles in order to arrive. Africa, should you not be learning your lesson? That what had happened was you completely decided to stay paternalistic toward Africa, and you missed reading the switch. So it's important for us to see that China, yes, has come around the continent. And by the way, I am good at telling them, hey, guys, you think you're having a good time in Africa? I'm sorry for you. The younger generation of Africans are not going to allow you. All of these deals that you're signing in closed rooms and thinking that they're going to remain closed, hey, they're coming for you. Because the truth is, the younger generation, and if you've been following the news, you can see what's going on in Nairobi, in Kenya. It's a strong appetite for accountability in governance. That definitely departs, in a way, from the silent generation, from the baby boomers generation. I'm a baby boomer, but I'm a kind of very, unusual baby boomer, because nobody keeps me quiet, about governance. I care about governance. It's the reason I was one of the co-founders of Transparency International, that global body that talks about fixing issues of corruption and poor governance. So to tie this all up is to say that if you looked at Africa from the lens of humanitarian axis, your whole foreign policy and economic policy direction will ignore it. But if you switched your mind and looked at what has happened and what is even going to happen more as we go toward green economies faster,
through that
Africa is that lens, you would find that Africa is part of your solution. If you looked at it from the lens of technology, Africa is part of the solution. If you looked at it in terms of, the minerals, some of the vast concentration of green economy minerals are going to be coming from Africa. So how can you possibly disconnect yourself from all of those opportunities? When I talk about Africa, I don't say to people, please come and help Africa. No. I basically speak of Africa from a place of, hey, do something smart for yourself.
Can I add on that, and in the context of, I was going to ask you to, not your political analyst hat, but your economic analyst hat, respond to that, but then I want you to give advice to the new government in South Africa about what the priorities should be, and then I'm going to look to Chito to see are those similar to those in other countries?
Yes. So the first, I totally agree with Obi. This thing of humanitarian case versus the business case. What I've said many times is that, Africa, the people who can really address the problems of Africa, it's us Africans. This idea, which is the case that Obi is making, and that is, don't look at, for the Western nations, the way to deal with Africa is about how do you talk about investment, right? How do you talk about trade? How do we work around, cooperating on matters that are instrumental in encouraging business in the African continent? That should be the perspective. And as Africans, I think for us, it's very important that we see ourselves as the fixer, as the people who are going to shape the destiny of our nations in Africa. I've said repeatedly that the problems of Africa will never be fixed by foreign institutions or foreign governments, right? They will be fixed by us as Africans, right? We have to, we've touched on business, but also remember, we also need to adjust, or to address the issues on governance. Opi just touched on governance, which is something she's passionate about. Issues like governance. In my country, where we have issues, that have to deal with crime, issues of blackouts, we've seen over the years. It's us Africans who have to fix those things, to make our environment attractive, So this idea from Western nations that we must see Africa as somehow people who just need aid, I'm saying that we don't want that. We want to work to fixing Africa. And I believe that it begins with us young people, who have to fix the continent moving forward. Now, Elliot, you are saying, what should I tell my government? They usually don't listen. Well, I think, firstly, there are many structural issues that we face in the country, right, that need to be addressed. The main thing that is really affecting young people is the issue of unemployment, right? The joblessness in the country. It's at a shocking level. We have young people that can't find jobs. You have businesses that have been negatively impacted with the blackouts that we've had over the years. So I mean, jobs is what South Africans need, right? It's also the issues of around of governance, around law enforcement, the issues of addressing the issues of crime as well, that has impacted us in our country. I think that should be the priority as well. And those goals, they go together, fix those issues. Issues of education, very much important in our country, where we see in terms of educational outcomes, the situation is not good. So I think the government would focus on those basic things. Why do you want to do that, Elliot? That's because you want to empower people in the country, most of whom are black, right? They account for, when it comes to unemployment, they're the most affected. When it comes to poverty, they're the most affected, right? So you want to create them an environment where they are skilled and they are able to compete, and also very much entrepreneurship, very much important if you want to really uplift the lives of South Africans, because mainly what is negatively affecting them is joblessness. It's a huge problem.
So Chido, you're now advising the entire continent. Is it the same? I mean, to what degree are the structural problems that we talked about, are they similar? And what are the priorities in your view that must be addressed?
Talk is cheap. Like Pumlazi said, if the government listened, I think Africa would be in a different place. But we also need to take a step back to just acknowledge that this is not uniquely African, right? This is a global issue right now. Mm-hmm. And that's what's driving the populist, conservative, nationalistic, bellicose sentiments, right, that we see going. I refused to watch the debate last night because I think I'm depressed enough
you're lucky,
as it is.
By the way.
Right? But these are the same sentiments. So writ large, it's the fundamental crisis of democracy. The fact that the contracts that the state entered with its citizen, right, that the state has not been able to meet its part of the contract, right? So the dividends of democracy is essentially lost. And so that is what translates into this cost of living crisis across Africa. That's what is happening in South Africa. That's what is happening in Nigeria. And by the way,
Say it.
Right?
Right?
Are you censoring yourself?
Pardon me?
Well, don't censor yourself.
No. Well, so, there's, again, somebody said they are the optimists in chief, I want to say that I am the optimist in chiefess, right? But it is really serious in Nigeria, because I'm Nigerian. It's the same, crisis of the cost of living. That's what happened in Ghana. Ghana nearly tipped over Ghana, right? That's what happened in Nairobi several years ago. That's why Sudan is in an unending war. So this is the problem across Africa, but also across most of the world, right? Is the crisis of democracy. So I don't think we are looking at Africa as a different kettle of fish here. We're looking at Africa as the same, but that there are certain specificities, right, with Africa. That's the first. There's a tag on to that. Was I supposed to advise them?
No, that's good.
Right? Well, so again, and I do completely agree with Pumlazi that Africa should solve Africa's issue, right? Because there's a level of idiocy among leaders, right? And there's a level of dysfunction. But we also have to acknowledge that there's an insidiousness to the external global economic structure that seems to perpetually position Africa in this place.
Yeah, let me continue on an element of that, talking about global structure and how it affects Africa. What are the risks, if I may go back to you, of the competition between the United States, China, and Russia in Africa, and the decline of multilateralism, the corollary of that? How does that play out in the continent, and what are the problems, and how do we move forward?
Yeah.
And I mean, anybody could address it. I mean, we don't have to say, but please start.
Okay, so multilateralism for many decades did manage to hold together. We agree certain universal values that we could govern ourselves by. But the problem of that is that many decades after, with so many shifts, it is difficult to retain the existing models of multilateralism and expect that the rest of the world would agree to a global governance system that excludes majority of the world. And as economies are becoming, economies outside of the Western model are becoming very influential and important, there is that demand for a more inclusive and equitable system of global governance. And that basically is suffering at this time because we can't find collaboration and cooperation in a world where we have the great power competition between the US on the one hand and China, Russia tagging along. Yeah, tagging along. So with that context, there are important global issues that need to be solved. There is incredible levels of inequality, and the inequality is beginning to make what we know to work. I believe in the capitalist model of solving problems. The markets do work. The markets even work for the poor. But the markets create disparities in outcomes if, as we have seen, the market rigs itself against the weak and the poor. Therefore, we're now having people who are questioning the markets and questioning everything about capitalism. It should be those who care about capitalism that should be at the center of saying, let's fix this before it goes out of control. We can't get to that in a world where we have all of these issues that seem to divide the ones that should be bringing together. You look at the global risks that we're facing. Look at the health pandemic. I mean, like, when you looked at the World Economic Forum list of ranking of risks that our world was going to face in 2019, 2020, health risk was not even showing on the spectrum of 1 to 10. But it came upon us. And suddenly we realized that we're so interconnected and yet have not figured how to have the kind of global systems of surveillance and collaboration and cooperation. These are real global public bads. We're going to see many more of them. Cybersecurity. We're going to deal with the challenges of AI, artificial intelligence. We're going to be dealing with rapid issues of the adverse impact of climate change. We're going to deal with everyday conflicts and insecurities around our world. If we cannot find a model of multilateralism that brings not just the people that have been outside of it, a good case is that of Africa. Africa with more than 54 countries. What people expect Africa to do at the United Nations is vote with them. How do you do that? You just expect them to tag along with you. And Africa calls out your inconsistencies all the time. You know, part of what has robbed the US and Europe of its friendship with Africa is that Africa has endured so much double standards. You can't preach. You know, my father always said, Elliot, that character is not complete until it is consistent. Integrity is not complete until it is consistent. So you can't in one context say, hey, our values matter. And then in another context, the values suddenly don't matter. Simply because he's a son of a gun, but he's our own son of a gun. No. That universal application of the values that would connect the way that we're dealing with countries, the way that we're dealing with issues. Look at global trade. Global trade is in trouble. Europe and America preached the greatness of trade to all of us. We bought into it because there's hard evidence to show that you can't get to development, you can't get to economic growth without trade. And yet, what's going on? Yep. The same people are suddenly discovering the beauty of protectionism. Please, you know, so it is all of those things that are creating deeper tensions, and they actually are making it more difficult for Africa because exogenous shocks often have a way of hitting Africa too badly. And we've suffered that too frequently because of the bad behavior coming from the advanced economies. I hope I'm still...
No, it's
That's a quick...
You want to just jump in? And
Yeah, I want to add, because I see we're running out of time.
No, we're fine.
So I want to add here, and that is Professor Neil Ferguson. He's one of the speakers here, I understand. He spoke in the first festival. His argument over the past few years until now is that we're already in a Cold War between China and the US. My concern as we enter this sort of global tension or global superpowers now, this phase of tensions, is that Africans will be caught up in a very difficult situation that I wouldn't want, right? If this thing intensifies, right? Because remember, we are still catching up, as OP has been, been putting it out in a very nice way. We are still catching up. There's a lot we need to do to develop our economies. So if it happens that we end up things becoming what they were in the first Cold War, where you had nations having to somehow choose who to align with, for Africans, that will be very much problematic. And partly because Africa's biggest trader is China right now, right? South Africa's biggest trader as well is China. And then you have the US, UK, and Germany following below that. So there is this... and at the same time, we have to deal with the West as well in terms of trade and addressing the very serious challenges we face. So I'm concerned that if this thing intensifies, it's going to be not good for the African continent that needs a peaceful world that is more driven by globalization, and trade. That's what Africans need, and that's what we are looking for in order to fix our nation.
I wholly agree with you, but I think there's also a point of departure here, right? Africa is smart.
Of course.
Right? And there's historical antecedents to show that Africa will do just well if the Cold War intensifies. There was the era of non-alignment. It was a structural and policy engagement of the Cold War. And by the way, I think that we have come up to the limits of the Cold War now. I don't know if, because where else do we go? Nukes here, nukes there. You get a nuke, I get a nuke. I don't think that's going to happen, right? I think we've come up to, and by the way, so all this posturing, like where else do we move with this posturing? And Africa has learned to navigate the landscape well. The president of Nairobi, Ruto, was in the US, and we hosted him, and one of the questions is because he has significant trade relations with China, as he has with the US and continues to quote US. And the question is, how do you manage these relationships? And he said, it's work in progress, right? It's a delicate balance, and that's what Africa does. So we are not hoping that the Cold War continues. We're hoping that sane heads, that heads settle, and that, these dudes just come to the table and think of, excuse my language, I'm a feminist. And so, and again, I say dudes because you look at the people on the table, and we're wondering, where are the women? And so I think that Africa will be just fine. However, we need to be talking about global trade relations, not just the African variant of it. I agree with what Madam Obi has said, that multilateralism is suffering, and in that case, perhaps, we'll look at the inequality that it creates, right, in terms of perhaps Africa's very minimal percentage in the special drawing rights, right? Or Africa's very minimal percentage in the global climate crisis funds, right? I think those are some of the real issues that we need to be talking about in terms of multilateralism or bilateralism or some of these structural trade conditions. Outside of that, I think Africa has come a long way, and if we talk in terms of resource management, and Africa is able to transform, leapfrog, right, into value chain production, and with its vast mineral and critical earth and all of that, I think Africa might just be all right.
I'm sure. Well, I want to turn to the audience. Oh my goodness gracious! So I'm going to reply just to the first on the corner. That was the first hand I saw. Then we'll go to the back. And if you could be very brief in the questions, because there are just so many of them.
Okay, great. Hi, my name is Natalie. I'm from Kenya, where everything is happening currently. And happy to be here as a fellow. This has been such a fulfilling discussion. I think it's one that's been most relatable for me, who's been here all week. And I just want to ask, I think primarily to Elliot, and building on what Chido has shared about global trade relations, what is the Institute working towards in as far as more inclusivity and having more Africans, more Asians in these spaces to share on these matters?
Well, I sort of already said that a little. I'd rather hear from the rest of the group a question. But the Institute, we've been around 75 years. It's going to be our 75th anniversary. We were founded by people with a very global outlook. We were founded by a German American. Mm-hmm. We brought people from all over the world here to talk about how to make a better world. I think what we need to do is increase our presence in all parts of the world, because we're all about dialogue and with shared perspective. And that's why I am so delighted, for example, that we finally will have a significant, meaningful presence in Africa. Indeed, in your own country will be the base of it, just as we now have in India, for example. So we couldn't agree more. Well, because the microphone may be right there, but then we'll go back to this gentleman. Oh, yeah, there's a mic there, please.
Oh, sure. Thank you so much for your insights and contributions to the conversation. My name is Michael Ford, and I'm an Aspen Fellow, and I have a nonprofit that seeks to inject Black voices into the conversation of China. And so that's exactly what my question relates to. China has, as you mentioned, heavily invested millions, hundreds of millions of dollars into many economies within Africa. To what extent will this impact or maybe conflict with many African countries' sovereignty and or future development in the next 100 years?
Who wants to take that?
So So there are various schools of thought, right, in examining or considering Africa's engagement in Africa. There is the debt diplomacy school of thought. There is the recolonization school of thought, and then there is the geopolitics school of thought. And then you have several other smaller configurations along that spectrum. But it is to say, as has been said here, that Africa is an agent, right? Africa has agency. And outside of dysfunctional, self-interested deals, China provides funds for development. Right? If we bracket self-interested, again, idiocy, right? China provides funds for, and that is what people like you do, right? Because you mobilize and aggregate these voices that will then put pressure on the government of the day to make deals, right? Or navigate this relationship so that it benefits the masses, right? So I think this, like Madam Obi has said, China, I think it's insidious, but that's not to say, right, that we should not look at China with a critical lens. We know that there's been billions of dollars of deals that are substandard, and we know that China has its ideological issues, right? Hence the benevolent lender. We know all of that. However, Africa needs funds. One of the main issues in Africa has been underfunding of development. And that's part of why China, of course, with all that, seems to be making such inroads in Africa. What is the US going to do about this? What is the EU going to do about this? I think that's the question.
Okay, was there a question over here? And then we'll go to this young lady in the second row.
Question I've got is about the effectiveness of the African Union and how it's doing for being able to improve trade throughout Africa and through the rest of the world.
Thank you very much for raising an important component of what is a big deal on the continent now. The Africa Continental Free Trade. Africa is the continent with the lowest regional trade, that is internal trade within the continent, within its continent, compared to, say, Europe at 70%, North America at more than 50%, and Asia at, more than 45%. So with Africa being at about anytime between 12 and 15%, there's a wide margin to reach. That area is now the largest trade area, but there is a lot of work to be done in actually getting to implementation. And so some of the issues of the institutional harmonization, issues around customs, issues around trade, tariff issues, as well as non-tariff barriers that have to be dealt with, these are the big banana items. And we're sort of saying to the politicians that the political rhetoric is enough. You've signed this, and it is now time to get the technocrats to work very hard at implementing.
Okay, this will have to be our last question here, and then perhaps some of our guests can stay afterwards and answer some questions before you go on to something else, but please.
Thank you. My question is for Dean Wancourt. Thank you so much for being here. Your work focuses on women, and I was wondering if you might speak to the fact that when Nigerians come to America, they are remarkably successful. Statistically, I think they beat the records. However, when you go to Nigeria, you see women who are cooking in kitchens that have wooden stoves. Can you tell me why that is and what we can do about it?
Well, I couldn't ask for a better last question.
Get out of my closet, will you? I mean, I don't know where to start, right? The future is female. And decidedly female, as a matter of fact. if we're talking about climate transition, clean energy and all of that, it is deeply gendered. In fact, I was just discussing with someone about the fact that, the mining in Nigeria is artisanal now, and so the government just made a policy because there is so many women, because it's artisanal and women earn less, and they said collectivize. And so now you have over 1,450 collectives, but you have only 30 women-led collectives, right? But this is an industry that's primarily women. And so how do we bring women to the table? How do we make these issues that are so obviously gendered policy ones? In terms of the climate, so I keep thinking, across Africa, over 80% of women still cook with firewood. You have the inhalation, smoke inhalation, the health issues. You have the domestic violence, right? Of men coming, oh, the food is not ready. Why is the food not ready? And you have, sexual violence. Girls go to collect firewood. You have drudgery, daily drudgery, where women don't have leisure because they spend hours collecting firewood, cooking, cleaning, all of that. So why is it so hard, if we're talking about energy transition, to bring clean cook stove to Africa? Because it will be such a small change with an outsized impact. When do we start? This, I think we're creating another industrial development complex in this energy transition. Yeah, let's really transform these big, highfalutin conversations to daily implications that does, in fact, transform lives on the ground.
I want our presidential candidate to have a final word on this topic.
So I normally say that there are 3 game changers that will transform the continent and therefore enable it to claim the 21st century. And I say it's the women, the young people, and technology. These 3 things, evidence-based, will definitely transform Africa. On the subject of what we're doing and not doing well, it goes straight to the door of governance. And in that space of governance, there are 2 key and critical things that governments across Africa would need to tackle: productivity and competitiveness. And these 2 things are basically crying out for the right sets of policies, the right sets of institutions, and the right choices of investment. For as long as we can fix the politics and democracy of our continent, we stand a fighting chance of being able to improve productivity, because, by the way, productivity cannot happen at the level that we need for growth if we still have 9 out of every 10 children on our continent not achieving minimum proficiency level in literacy, numeracy, and socio-emotional skills. Therefore, there is a massive need for competence in governance. There's a massive need for ethics in governance. There's a massive need for the capacities that should be able to solve basic problems of governance. And where that ties into the whole thing you said about women is that in Nigeria, only 4% of women hold political representation, compared to Rwanda at almost 68%, or your country at 25%, her country actually, at 25%. Now, why is this so bad and accentuated? It is because we unfortunately, we are the country that has had the worst set of political parasites. They have been parasitic about the Nigerian state. And so changing that structurally requires that some crazy set of women should work together with men who are ready to be honorary women. And I happen to say that on the basis of he for she. When you see strong men who understand the power of us optimizing our human resources, knowing that gender inclusion, using your women is smart economics. When we see that more and more amongst men, and they come to the table with women to design pathways, political representation begins to matter. The quality of governance actually begins to change. On this note, I say to you, thank you very much for the opportunity. I want you to celebrate my husband, because he's one of those kinds of men I was talking about. Pastor Chinedu has a question.
And remember to get my book. My book is available in the bookstore.
Yes, and buy his book.
Buy my book at
Buy his
bookstore.
book.